Just to let you know, the meeting is now live. Yeah, we are live now.
Okay, it's 7 o'clock, so good evening and welcome along to tonight's Rushcliffe Borough Council's Growth and Development Scrutiny Group meeting. I need to remind everyone that the meeting is being recorded and live streamed on the Council's YouTube channel, so welcome to people who are watching on YouTube. And in addition, under the Local Authorities Executive Arrangements, Meetings and Access to Information England Regulations 2012, other people may film, record, tweet or blog from this meeting. The use of any such images or sound recordings is not under the Council's control. So with those advisory notes, we'll go into the agenda. So the first item on the agenda is, do we have apologies for absence, please?
We do, Chairman. We have apologies from Councillor Clark and Councillor Murray, and we have Councillor Dickman here and Councillor Gowden. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and welcome, Councillor Dickman, for your first meeting here and standing in, so thank you. And do we have any declarations of interest? Anyone wish to declare anything? I suspect not. No? Okay, thank you. So item 3 is the minutes of the previous meeting held on the 14th of July. So those of us who were here, are we happy that they're correct minutes and I should sign them? Thank you, so I will do. I'm signing on behalf of the chairman, really, but there. So we have any actions from the previous meeting. I think there was one action to report, which is on page 9, which was that members requested a copy of the presentation slides from that night's meeting in respect of the items on cycling networks in the borough for us to consider at the April meeting of the Growth Development Scrutiny meeting, when cycling networks is next reported. I think we did receive those presentations, so we were happy we did. And so with that in mind, do we have any actions arising? Oh no, I've just done that, haven't I? So that was the actions arising. So we did receive the minutes, the presentation about the cycling networks. Right, so we'll get into the main items for tonight's meeting then. So item 5, with the first item is an update and a discussion about a community infrastructure levy. And you'll see at the back of the report, we do have some recommendations as well, which we'll come to later. So Kathy, are you talking? Sorry, Matt, sorry, Matt. Yes, you're leading us through this, aren't you? So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Can everybody hear me okay? Is that fine? Okay. Yes, so today I'll be presenting on the a brief update to the community infrastructure levy and primarily discussing the proposed allocation and spend procedure that we are looking to put in place to a bit of background initially to recap. So what the levy is it is a fixed rate charge on new development based on the amount of floor space being created, and we charge that on new residential and some types of commercial retail space effectively for new developments. That's been in place for pretty much 2 years on the nose, plus a week, I guess, since adoption on 7th of October 2019. And it is intended to address the cumulative impact of development across the entire borough. And I'll get onto this in a moment, rather than what we may be more traditionally used to through Section 106. It is for to be applied across the borough as a strategic fund, and it was supported by evidence alongside the adoption of our local plan Part 2, and so that evidence is key in terms of how we're looking at applying the SIL to infrastructure across the borough. So these are the key differences between traditional Section 106 planning obligations and the levy. So planning obligations are intended to mitigate the specific impacts of a development. So, you know, if you had a scheme of, say, 150 houses coming forward, that would have its own impacts on healthcare, education, highways, etc. So that is where we would look at Section 106 obligations to say, is this acceptable? And if not, what mitigation needs to be provided? Conversely, the community infrastructure levy, it is to offset the cumulative impact of development. So it's not intended to address specific developments, but rather as housing and such comes forward in the borough, to make sure that over the long term, it can be mitigated against in terms of providing certain items in infrastructure. Section 106 planning obligations are negotiable and often subject to viability on individual planning applications. So often we have situations where a developer will come along and say, oh, well, this is what's being asked for in terms of what our development can deliver. We can only afford to pay this much or provide this much by way of affordable housing, etc. Whereas the community infrastructure levy is non-negotiable and a fixed rate charge, and the viability essentially was carried out at the point it was adopted. So in terms of setting our rates, we made sure at the time that we were setting them that they were appropriate and wouldn't jeopardise development coming forward in those areas. So that is how that works in terms of making sure that you know, we're able to deliver housing targets, etc. Section 106 planning obligations can be secured toward all types of infrastructure, provided it complies with the tests. People may be familiar with the tests that in order to apply a planning obligation, it needs to be necessary and reasonable in terms of how it applies to that development. For the community infrastructure levy, it is restricted to specific types of infrastructure as we define in our infrastructure list. Now, the items which I'll get onto a bit later in our list have been chosen because they are more strategic in terms of how we might look at their impact. So particularly for things like health, for instance, health is more generally dealt with in a borough-wide nature. Often catchments for specific surgeries, etc., can be quite large, and we need to make sure effectively that where we're applying SIL, it's sort of appropriate to that type of infrastructure. The individual contributions for planning obligations are often tied to specific works and are often subject to a time limit. So usually where we secure a planning obligation, it will be identified that, you know, an upgrade to this particular play area is needed, and there will usually be a time limit to say, well, if it's not delivered within this time limit, was it really necessary in the first place, effectively? So that is the case generally with Section 106, whereas with SIL, they can be spent more flexibly and there's no time limit for use of funds. So depending on the nature of what we're looking to deliver, and this is the case with some authorities may save up to deliver a very large infrastructure item, or they may spend it more readily on, you know, smaller projects to help in the long term with the deliverability of infrastructure within their area. And finally, Section 106 generally can only be sought on larger or major development sites, primarily because obligations need to be necessary and appropriate, and generally would only apply them to schemes above 10 dwellings, certainly, whereas SIL applies to all types of development, regardless of scale. So you can potentially get SIL off of potentially even residential extensions, although that is rare, all the way up to your large housing development. So it captures money from a wider range of developments through SIL. On to our current situation with SIL funding. To date, we've collected a total of around £1.1 million under the levy within that 2 years. And bearing in mind that SIL is only collected upon commencement of development, but is applied from when permission is granted, that figure will look to rise going forward. So we are now at the stage where we're looking to obviously try and apply and look at where that money can be spent. So we've undertaken a consultation with the key infrastructure providers for the items on our infrastructure list, which is listed there below, and is also included in Appendix B with the report. So that sets out what our colleagues at the County Council, the CCG, and our own internal departments have indicated are their aspirations for where SIL will be spent and approximate timescales for such spend. The next step in the process is to identify and assess, or assess rather, those identified projects against a framework. And the framework is what is being developed and is what we hope to take to Cabinet next month for effectively implementation. So we can agree a spending programme, or as I think we may end up referring to it, as an infrastructure delivery plan. That tends to be what local authorities generally refer to this sort of document as. So it's essentially outlining what we are seeking to deliver by way of infrastructure, and what approximately what proportions of money we might allocate to those projects and the timescales for delivery. And there you can just see on the infrastructure list we have the 5 main items. So secondary education, park and ride and bus priority measures in West Bridgeford, indoor leisure, health facilities, and playing pitches and ancillary facilities. So those are the items which we are looking at for the spend of SIL. This is the intended process, a brief outline. So step one, we've already effectively done that in terms of identifying the projects. Step two is where we are at the moment in terms of looking at getting that provisional list assessed against a framework document. That would be subject to Cabinet agreeing the spending programme based on the outcome of that assessment. And then we will notify the beneficiaries of those funding allocations effectively to say, here is what the proposal is for the spend of SIL going forward. That will effectively form, I'd say, a document that people can refer to in terms of submitting details specifically for schemes. So at the point that we're sort of deciding where funding might go, we might not have a full level of information that we need in order to make sure that SIL is being spent appropriately, and we might not have a full idea of the amount of funding available and the amount of funding that might be needed. So the specific details is proposed to have them formally submitted, similar to the current procedure that we have for Section 106 agreements, in terms of identifying the specific projects and specifically allocating that money, and that will follow much the same procedure that we use for Section 106, all the way through to project completion and the spend of funds. We will monitor the spend programme to address any change in priorities, say a project stalls or there is a change in the aspirations of a certain area. One of the benefits of SIL is it is more flexible and it's not tied down to those specific works. So we want to retain that flexibility in terms of how we can apply SIL and not, focusing too much on saying, well, this is definitely allocated to that and that's the end of it. So we do want to retain that flexibility. And it's anticipated that we will repeat this full process at least every 5 years, potentially more frequently if there is a desire for it or there is any significant change. So potentially it would be repeated at the point, say, that we've gone through and we've spent all the money that had been received at the point that we've last undertaken the procedure, and then we'd run it through the process again effectively to make sure that we're reviewing it on a frequent enough basis. These are the main 4 points that we would look at assessing any SIL project against. So this is the outline of what the framework appraisal would include. So the main element would be the justification for the project, why it's needed, whether it's the most suitable project to help address that particular need or particular element of SIL, and a due regard for any alternatives to the scheme and why it might be the most appropriate. Then there'll be the strategic benefits. So as SIL is a strategic fund, we want to make sure that it does link to existing and emerging plans and objectives, and also a consideration of those funding gaps that we identified when adopting SIL. So in terms of when we looked at the amount that we would generate through SIL over a particular period and the rates that we did set, there's an anticipation that we would spend a certain amount to cover the funding gaps in those particular areas. So in the long term, we want to make sure that we are applying SIL appropriately and in accordance with that. So not spending everything on, say, healthcare and then leaving very little for education, for instance. So it's a bit of a balancing act in terms of making sure that those funding gaps are sort of accounted for. And I expect that we will go through at least 2 rounds of this process, covering the period that SIL was based around. I believe it's up until 2029. And then we may review what those funding gaps are and then again reapply that methodology to the SIL moving forward. Third point is the funding. So how much SIL is actually being requested, what the actual cost of the project is, and any other available funding sources, including match funding and time-limited funding that may be unlocked through SIL. And lastly is deliverability. So any other things that need to be addressed in order for the project to move forward, how far along in the process it is, any things that may impact or impediment delivery, and the timescales for delivery in terms of where it might sit within the spend programme. So I'm just going to go through those 4 points in a little more detail. So there's a few main questions that the justification element should answer. Does the project essentially comply with what SIL must be used for? So does it include provision, improvement, replacement, operation, or maintenance in infrastructure? And how does it support the development of the borough? We want to demonstrate that a project is supporting development rather than and is supporting it in the best way. Again, if there are any alternatives to the proposal, why is the identified scheme considered to be the most suitable? So in terms of any alternatives that have been discussed in terms of where we might be applying SIL, how has the decision been reached to pursue this project in particular? And then how far advanced is the project? We are more likely to be able to commit funding to projects that are further along in development, and certainly for schemes that we're looking at funding and delivering in the short term, we would seek to have a good level of information to make sure that we're fully conscious of the implications of that scheme and making sure that it can come forward in the timescale that we're looking at. As I'm sure people may be aware, it can take quite a while for schemes to come forward, and there's a lot of a lot more to consider than just how much money we're allocating through SIL. Next are the strategic benefits. So again, we do want to make sure that SIL is supporting the aims and objectives of the council, and potentially, where the county are involved or CCG, that if the other bodies have, particular strategies or things that they're working towards, how it fits in with those as well. We want to make sure that we're sort of assessing projects within a similar category of infrastructure around the same documents to ensure consistency. So certainly for some of the items on our list, we've already identified our own leisure facilities strategy and the playing pitch strategy as being key documents that we would work around in terms of assessing those projects and working out, which ones we would potentially seek to fund them and to what level. And then just going back to that point about funding gaps, wanting to make sure that in the long term, those funding gaps are readily accounted for, and making sure that projects in the long term are roughly in accordance with those. Thirdly, on funding, SIL is a limited pot. It might, so we've got 1.1 million at the moment, but when we get down to the actual allocation and spend of that, it probably won't go as far as I think we may think. So we want to strike a balance between giving enough funding to projects to ensure that they can go ahead and be delivered and not to risk delivery, but also make sure that we're applying SIL as efficiently as possible. So extra consideration will be given, I would expect, towards schemes where other funding streams are unlocked through match funding, or whether it's or where it's utilising time limited funding in terms of how we might bring projects forward. So again, being from a pragmatic perspective, wanting to use SIL as effectively as possible to bring forward projects. And I'll get onto this last point in a couple more slides, subject to the recommendation about making additional SIL available to non-neighbourhood plan parishes. We may be able to identify areas where parishes have let us know that they are seeking to use additional funds that have been collected in their area to support those projects that then may seek to deliver. As I say, we'll get onto that in just a moment. Lastly, deliverability. We'd seek at probably identifying sort of three main timescales for delivery: short term, 1 to 5 years; medium term, 3 to 7 years; and long term, 5 to 10 years. In terms of short-term projects, these are generally the projects where the only ones rather where we would look at allocating or apportioning the SIL funds that we've collected to date against. So we don't want to necessarily be sitting on funds that we've collected for a long period of time unless there is a reasonable reason to do so. So it would generally only be those short-term projects that we would look at identifying specific amounts of SIL towards. Medium-term projects, we may consider utilising SIL that we collect during the intervening period. So until we go back to the start of the process again, obviously we are collecting SIL over a longer period of time. So any SIL that we do collect in that interim period, we may look at how that might be applied to those sort of medium-term projects. And then long-term projects, they're more likely to be, far enough in the future or aspirational at this stage, where we're not looking at identifying specific amounts, but we would probably still use them in the spending plan to identify primarily those funding gaps. So, for instance, the park and ride, which the county have identified as being aspirational at this stage, it does form part of what we are seeking to fund through SIL, and that spending gap is, one that's been identified. So it would be included primarily for information to say, bearing in mind in the future, there may be SIL that we want to apply towards this, but as we go through this process multiple times, we'll get more information about when those kind of projects are being anticipated as being delivered, and what level of funding they might need. So thinking about things like potentially secondary education, which does have the largest funding gap as identified. We may, at that point, when we have more information about, say, when a secondary project is coming forward that looks to utilise SIL, it may be that we need to start building up a bit more of a pot to make sure that we can adequately fund that when it does come to fruition. So again, there's a bit of a balancing act in terms of what we might fund through SIL in the more immediate term, and then what we're looking at in the longer term. And then finally, any risks or barriers to delivery should be identified, and information on how we can overcome those, or basically bearing in mind what potential problems might be encountered which might jeopardise delivery. And we do, as I say, always have the opportunity to review the list and retain that flexibility in terms of where SIL might be applied should a project stall. On to neighbourhood SIL now. So just to cover what this is, under the SIL regulation 59A, we are required to pass a proportion of the levy that we collect in particular areas to the town or parish council for that area. 15% capped at £100 per council taxable dwelling in areas without a neighbourhood plan, or 25% where there is a neighbourhood plan. This is a statutory duty, and is something that effectively we are required to do under the legislation. Now, there is a desire to make an additional amount of the strategic SIL available to those areas without a neighbourhood plan, essentially to top up the amount so it's in line with that 25% that would be provided to areas with a neighbourhood plan, to sort of make it consistent across the borough. The important thing to note is that this neighbourhood proportion is distinct from strategic SIL, and it's more flexible in terms of it doesn't have to be used for items on our infrastructure list, and it can be spent on a wider range of projects, not just infrastructure. It's got a reasonably nebulous definition of anything that helps address the demands a development places on an area. So the fact that this the neighbourhood SIL that we have to pass across is subject to different requirements, we need to make sure that any additional SIL that we do make available to parishes is more, I'd say, more tightly controlled, because at the end of the day, we as the borough council are responsible directly for that additional money. So it's proposed that if we do allow local councils to be able to utilise that funding, they still need to go through the additional process similar to how it's currently done under Section 106 to apply for those monies. So we can make sure that any request does fall within that title definition, and is applied towards the infrastructure in our infrastructure list. There is the potential to change our infrastructure list. There's not a requirement to reconsult on a change in the infrastructure list. So it may be possible that we can add, say, a category of infrastructure to say local projects in non-neighbourhood plan areas, but we need to carefully consider how that might impact on strategic delivery. And also, it may be that certain non-neighbourhood plan areas don't have any particular desire to, or they may not collect a amount that is reasonably useful to them to apply in their area. So another alternative is local councils can support bids from other bodies where they won't be delivering that infrastructure directly. So if, for instance, they had an additional amount of neighbourhoods or an additional amount of strategic SIL that they might look to utilise, they could support, say, a bid from the CCG to apply towards healthcare in their area, for instance, just to give them more a sense that that SIL that they have available to them is being used to support their area, even if they may not be delivering it directly. So that proposed method for allowing that additional strategic seal for local councils. So we'll go through the recommendations now. Is the seal allocation and spend process, do members support the referral of that process to Cabinet? This is the first question. Then do members support making the recommendation to Cabinet for the additional amount of strategic seal for non-neighbourhood plans areas? Is that supported? Whether there are any comments and recommendations about the allocation and spend process, and any comments and recommendations about the assessment criteria used in the framework appraisal, and then any other comments and considerations as well. So those are the questions that we will now be taking, I think. So back to Lauren, I think.
Okay, thank you, Matt. I must just point out that Mr. Sawyer is our planning contributions officer. If you haven't realised who Matt is, I should have introduced him at the start. So thank you for that. So we can start. Any comments or questions at this stage? I mean, we've had a useful update as to the difference between 106 and SIL. It's a new world for us in many ways. But I think it's a little clearer now as to what SIL is. So, any questions, or while we're thinking about that, so can we confirm? Have we haven't actually spent any SIL yet? Then it's still in effect in the bank, waiting to be allocated.
Yeah, that's correct. The only SIL that has left our accounts is the a small amount of that neighbourhood SIL that we have passed to a couple of our parish councils, and the next tranche of neighbourhood SIL is due out this month to some of those parish areas. So that's the only SIL that's been spent.
Waiting to be released. and on the charges, what I know we've got the charging structure in place. Would it be helpful just to remind members as to how we come up with those charges, or when we came up with those, and how we did that?
Yeah, so in terms of the level that we charge, the borough's set out into sort of zones based on, generally based on construction prices, and you'll have to forgive me because I don't know the full in-depth methodology that was used, but essentially it was setting out the areas where we could charge a certain amount and not, impact on delivery in those areas. So our highest charging zone, which covers a reasonable proportion of the borough, is £100 per square metre floor space being created, all the way down to zero on our allocation at Gamston. Essentially everything on that site has been reserved for being addressed under Section 106, just because it is a more complex site for many reasons. But in other areas, so areas like Eastleigh, Cockgrave, Keyworth, there are varying charging levels based on the prices effectively billed in those areas. So it was based around viability to make sure that it wasn't going to stop people applying to build, and then also looking at the funding gaps in the particular infrastructure areas that we're looking at providing, and over the period looking at how much we would expect to collect through SIL and how that might impact on addressing those funding gaps. So it's why keeping that list and those rough proportions is important, because we don't want to, say, leave education in the lurch just because they're not intending on, using SIL immediately. Obviously, we have collected Section 106 historically towards secondary education, and in terms of the planned projects that they have at the moment, I believe there's 4 projects they've sort of planned. They're not anticipating needing any additional funding through SIL, but when they get onto later projects, SIL will be the main way we have collected to address secondary education rather than Section 106.
Thank you. Now, you'll be pleased to know that Mr. Marshall, one of our area planning officers, is keen to come in on this, aren't you, Phil? Just to give us a bit more further explanation.
Well, I think Matt ultimately covered it at the end, but it's my fault. SIL was effectively in place, so I thought it'd be an opportunity to speak at this. Yes, when we developed our local plan, parallel to that, we developed an infrastructure delivery plan. And parallel to that, we did an assessment of viability to make sure that sites would deliver in terms of housing across the borough. Because there's no point in allocating a site and saying you need 50% affordable housing and X, Y, and Z planning contributions if it's unaffordable. So we went through that viability exercise, and in parallel with that, we went through the process of introducing SIL. So in terms of the viability exercise, there's standard assumptions that are made nationally in terms of profit for affordable housing, market housing, percentage of what you need to spend on things like legal fees. So there's that standard template, and the biggest variable is house sales values and land values in terms of expected land values. Now, they were plugged in using local information. They were sent out to consultation in terms of what we could reasonably ask for SIL across the borough. The borough's pretty varied in terms, although a lot of the borough are high house prices. There are some variations across the borough. So, for example, we seek a lower floor pounds per square metre in Cotgrave than we do, say, at Walton, because there's a difference in the house prices. So those rates went through examination by an independent examiner, and he found that they were reasonable, and then the council adopted. So I hope that gives a bit more of
it does, and it's about 2 years since we did that, isn't it? So,
it is.
Yeah.
But as Matt said, because SIL is chargeable on the start of when the planning permission is implemented. At the point of time of adoption, it was difficult to anticipate how much money we'd have in the pot by now and how much money we'd have in the future. But now we've got a better idea. We think it's right to try and bring in this spend procedure, so it's in place well in advance of when we're looking to spend.
Thank you. Any other questions or queries, comments on this? I don't want to hog the floor. Councillor Barney.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Phil. Yeah, I'm just wondering if members were minded to vote for the percentage increase for communities without a neighbourhood plan, when would that be applied to in real terms? I'm thinking particularly of Sutton Bollington and their situation at the moment with 15%.
I think we can certainly apply that, certainly apply that from the start of when we implemented SIL, I think is the most appropriate. Again, given we've not gone forward with any spend at this moment, and we're looking at producing that in line with this procedure, I don't see a problem of looking back over, the areas where there may have been SIL collected, and what is available to them. So I would expect it would cover, the period since we started charging SIL rather than going from this point onwards. So yeah, I don't think there should be any concern about when that additional amount would be available from.
Thank you. Does that help?
I won't lobby members with my smile.
Councillor White.
Thank you, Chair. Still on the neighbourhood plan uplift, the government is encouraging communities to produce neighbourhood plans. Do you think that this could prove a disincentive to do that, so they perhaps feel they don't need to? And the other thing is, it will reduce the strategic fund quite considerably, I would think. And what impact is that going to have to the major projects that are to some extent relying on this? I'm thinking particularly of the health centres from our point of view.
Thank you.
Yeah, some good questions there. I think it's important to look at, I suppose, again, because we have to treat that additional sill as if it, well, it is strategic sill at the end of the day. So in terms of any requests that do come forward, and you know, any allocation that we would seek of making, we would, I think, still have to put it through this framework process in terms of identifying how best to apply our strategic sill. The reason that when we've been talking through this additional amount that we would make, I suppose we should say make it accessible to rather than available to non-parish, non-neighbourhood plan areas, sorry, is to, I suppose, there's two sides to this coin, because obviously there are areas where they feel that they would have a benefit from potentially having a neighbourhood plan, and in terms of developing a neighbourhood plan, we don't want SIL to be the sole incentive for that. I think it's important, certainly where there is a neighbourhood plan in place, that the reason behind a neighbourhood plan being adopted is not so that, you know, additional money can be applied or you know, passed over through SIL. It's so that you know, the aspirations of that area can be met. Because as far as I'm concerned, there's no point in adopting a neighbourhood plan if there's no you know, there's no substance to it effectively. So in some ways we do want to encourage where areas are looking at potentially adopting a neighbourhood plan, that they have a good reason to, rather than it just being, oh, we want to have extra SIL. So in some way, I would say that we want to make sure that while at the same time we want areas that would, you know, potentially benefit from having a neighbourhood plan, bringing them into effect, where, you know, it isn't necessarily desirable, particularly for smaller areas where, you know, the cost of adopting a neighbourhood plan can be quite, you know, quite significant. They don't feel that they are missing out on, you know, potentially the levels that are available to other areas. It's a difficult issue, I'm sure you can appreciate, because I think there's no pleasing every party in terms of, you know, if you do have a neighbourhood plan, that's all well and good, but if you don't, then is making the additional, it's complicated. It is what I say.
Well, it's complicated for you, it's complicated for us and the parishes as well. But thank you for that. Mr. Pegram, you want to come in?
Yeah, just to add to what Matt's saying and to help understand that aspect. Obviously, we've got a number of areas in the borough that haven't got a parish council. They have parish meetings, so clearly they will benefit from an element of SIL. We will hand over the 15%, but that's an example where they're very small areas. You wouldn't necessarily expect them to do a neighbourhood plan. So that, again, that's the sort of areas where they would benefit from the extra uplift potentially without having to do the neighbourhood plan.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a good
That
point.
is an important, and also I suppose it answers a question as well, that if I or we were a parish council that has got a neighbourhood plan and gone to the effort of having a neighbourhood plan, would we feel particularly put out that parishes who haven't got a neighbourhood plan are now getting an extra bit of SIL, and which is something for us to think and decide, and so yes. So councillor, yes, please press your right hand button, please.
Sorry, yeah, okay, thanks. Two questions. One is, do we, I mean, I assume we do, but do we know that the likely income from this over the next 5 years will be sufficient to pay for this list of schemes, identified schemes? Because it seems quite a lot of money, I would imagine, is required. Is it an expectation we'll cover all of those schemes, or some of them, depending on how much it comes in? And secondly, can you confirm that the arrangements for West Bridgeford that were organised last year are expected to continue for the next 5 years, or is that part of this plan? I can't see it in the document, but I might be missing it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Garland. I'll do your second question first. In terms of the West Bridgeford sill, as an area which is not covered by a town or parish council, it does, and this is the same for parish meetings, etc. It does fall under a slightly different element of sill in that it is, we as the borough council spend that sill to support that area as if we were the parish or town council for that area. So in effect, that process is separate because it is subject to those looser restrictions that are enjoyed by town and parish councils directly. So that process falls outside of this particular one. We're not looking at that spend as strategic sill. That is still neighbourhood sill, so it is being addressed through that separate group and that process is still going forward. The implication of this group on that is that when we're talking about that additional 10% of neighbourhood sill, that may also be, you know, looking at that in West Bridgeford as well. And I think that may be one of the areas where we certainly need to fully consider the impact on the strategic sill pot, because, you know, in terms of development coming forward, there's quite a lot in West Bridgeford, as I'm sure everybody's aware, and you know, how that might impact on the strategic delivery is certainly a consideration. In terms of your first point about how the additional amount will impact on the strategic pot, was that the, yeah. It's yeah, so sorry, in terms of 5 years, looking at how much we will have received, as Phil said a bit earlier, it is difficult to fully look at, you know, what we might expect to receive over a longer period. Once we're fully into the swing of SIL, i.e. the lag between planning permissions being granted and them actually being implemented has sort of passed, we will have a better idea of what we're anticipating, you know, getting year on year. It will become clearer, and we'll actually have some, you know, accurate data points of amounts that we've collected coming forward. We can only realistically rely on either SIL that we have collected or sites where they've commenced and there is SIL due through their instalment policy. In terms of any other SIL that might be potential in future, that we're not going to have a good idea of when that will, you know, we might be able to put a pin, say, you know, we might expect development to commence within this 3-year period from the grant of planning permission, but there's no guarantee, you know, that development could, you know, not go ahead. They might resubmit an application and then it would be delayed further. So we wouldn't want to rely on those provisional figures in terms of working out what we would look at spending through this spend program. So I think the purpose of the spend program is to identify effectively a order of priority, almost, to say, you know, in terms of short term, this is the money that we've collected and we can allocate short term to those projects. In terms of medium term, you know, we might be able to put some notional figures against those, but until we actually know what we're collecting through SIL, we're not going to specifically commit to those, but we might be able to order them to say, this is priority, you know, number 3, this is priority number 4 in terms of how they may come forward. And then looking at long term, you know, we can't realistically provide an estimate towards those projects. So again, I think as we go forward, and certainly in the second or third round of going through this process, we will have a better indication of how much SIL we will have at that point, and we may be able to make some firmer commitments to what to fund.
Thank you. Mr. Pedro, do you want to come in again?
Yeah, linked to that question, Chairman, and the response that Matt's given, I think it's important to recognise that the SIL pot is not going to totally fund every piece of infrastructure on that list. It is there to support the delivery of that infrastructure and effectively to plug funding gaps. So a new medical centre or school is 5s or 10s of millions. We're not going to have that much money available for one project. So it is going to be a case of, as I say, we'll look at funding gaps. So obviously the county may have funding for a secondary school to a certain level, and we'll look to top that up with the SIL. But as I say, it's not going to fund 100% every piece of infrastructure. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Can we go back to the length? SIL was introduced 2 years ago. Since then, changes have occurred in the borough in terms of parish boundaries. For example, some areas which were in a particular ward in 2019 may have changed a little bit, places like Ratcliffe, etc. Will there be any change or amendment to the SIL structure to allow for areas that may be perhaps disadvantaged as a result of that, or even unfairly advantaged? I mean, in other words, do we change the SIL structure to match things like parish boundaries and changes to wards, that sort of thing?
From what I understand, the changes are to ward boundaries that are proposed.
No, I'm thinking. Well, yes. I mean, there are proposed ward boundaries proposed. So looking ahead, then perhaps if the proposals, which I think most people have probably seen, go ahead, then some of the wards will change. So would that affect the way we operate SIL for those areas? Would we in effect have to start again for different wards?
I don't think we have to start again in terms of SIL. We'd still charge the rates that were set based on the original ward boundaries. And in terms of where money is given to in the future, if we collect money within a certain area, if the parish boundary is not changed, it will still go to that particular parish. But if the parish boundary does change in the future, then it will be spent, I anticipate, in the area of where that SIL has been collected. So
that's the crucial thing. Where it's been collected.
Where it's been
collected. Spent in the area in which it's collected.
So if the planning permission moves from one parish to another, that doesn't matter. It will still go to wherever that planning permission was.
Right. Okay. Good. Thank you. I mean, I know we are slightly uncertain areas here, but we need to get an idea.
Yeah, and sorry, just to add on that subject, in terms of, I know you mentioned about Radcliffe-on-Trent, and I know because of when we did the exercise for working out the SIL charges, that was based on old ward boundaries, and obviously it now bisects Radcliffe-on-Trent in terms of those two varying areas. So I think it's just important to clarify that the charging zones are not linked to the ward boundaries or parish boundaries or whatever the case may be at all. They are their own zones. It's just in terms of the methodology that we use when adopting the levy, those were that was the basis on which we applied it at the time. But yeah, it will always look at the point that the SIL is collected, neighbourhood SIL will go to the parish for that area, etc. So any changes, we wouldn't have to revamp our charging schedule. It's only, I think, if there was, a desire to review it at some point in the future, should, the demographics of certain areas change significantly, I think.
Okay, thank you. It certainly is complicated, which makes me wonder, the parishes, whether it's parish meetings or councils, I have the greatest respect for our parish councils because most of us are involved with them. Isn't this going to be a little bit complicated for them to get I mean, it's difficult for us to get our heads around, and I'm wondering whether parishes. So, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I can do, Chairman.
I'm thinking whether assuming we're doing what we're recommending to do tonight, I'm wondering whether there is an opportunity to perhaps offer more in the way of support to parishes and indeed parish meetings. Because if I was a parish, I'd be scared stiff by this.
I can confirm, Chairman, that one of the things that Matt is actually working on at the moment is guidance for the parish council. So, as he mentioned, some of the parish councils have already had some money given to them. We anticipate more coming through and being released this month. And one of Matt's things he's working on is guidance, because again, they will have to, like us, they will have to produce at the end of the year a statement saying what they've received, what they might have spent, and so on. So again, yes, we are supporting them through that, Chairman. And Matt is around to answer any questions from Parish Council, certainly.
Yeah, that guidance is due to go out this month alongside the next tranche of payments. We've not issued it yet because we were hoping that maybe the outcome of this meeting might inform what extra information we might need to provide to them. But yes, certainly in terms of their reporting responsibilities and what they can use their SIL for, we will try and give them as much information and as much support as possible in terms of navigating that. Fortunately, the requirements for parishes in terms of their spend is not as prescriptive as the strategic SIL. So I think it would be difficult for them to spend it inappropriately, as long as they're providing stuff that supports the development of their area. But they obviously need to be mindful of those reporting responsibilities and how they do use it. So
I'm wondering whether, assuming in a few moments when we go to the recommendations that's in the report, is it perhaps worth adding a little bit, perhaps an extra recommendation to reflect that, because to confirm that the parishes will receive guidance and advice from us, and
absolutely,
yeah, so perhaps we'll look at doing that. Right, we're discussing quite a lot here. Does anyone else want to come in with any? Councillor Way.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Going back to the extra bit you put onto people without a neighbourhood plan, I think it says here that the additional SIL will be subject to a narrower use of funds. Can you explain that, and is that going to be part of your guidance to the
yeah
parishes?
So the reason we're not going to I think a lot of the ways that when this was first posed, it was, can we just top up from 15 to 25% and pass that out to parished areas as if it was neighbourhood SIL. We cannot do that. It is, as I say, strategic SIL, and we need to bear in mind that it needs to be spent within that narrower definition. So one, on items that are in our infrastructure list. So that may limit in terms of what parish councils can actually spend on, because in our list we've got healthcare, secondary education. Those are obviously primarily going to be delivered by statutory bodies. And then transport and park and ride, which are very local in terms of is West Bridgeford and along the A52 corridor. So largely they'll probably primarily be looking at indoor leisure potentially, or playing pitches and ancillary facilities as where they might apply that SIL, unless we do add something to our infrastructure list to broaden that definition. So I suppose that is a way in which we may be more confident that we can deliver the strategic elements of SIL is if any additional strategic SIL will be offered to non-neighbourhood plan areas still has to be spent on those infrastructure items. I think that would be a good way of ensuring that we are still able to meet the strategic objectives of having adopted SIL. The other thing is the neighbourhood SIL doesn't just have to be spent on infrastructure. It can be anything else that supports the development of that area, and it's that broader, more nebulous definition, which is what the neighbourhood SIL can be used for, but not the strategic SIL. And we need to make sure that the strategic SIL is applied specifically to infrastructure. So again, that's why we need that extra assurances in place that at the end of the day, it's money that we are spending for use in those particular areas.
Thank you. I'm so glad you're here, because it's such a complex. Well, I think it is complicated, isn't it? Does that help? That clarify matters for you?
Yes, I think so. It's also about, will that be part of the guidance to parishes? Because I think it's important that
absolutely.
That's actually highlighted, that it's not. There's a difference between the original and the uplift in terms of what they can spend it on.
Yes, but Mr. Pegram.
Yeah, I think for clarity, the way I would see this process working is that the legislation says that we have to hand over 15% of the soil to areas without a neighbourhood plan, 25% to areas with a neighbourhood plan. So I think in terms of this element of it, we would hand over what we are required to by law, and we will earmark the other bit and hold on to that money and make the parish aware that that is available for them to bid for infrastructure projects. So that'll be the difference in the process, I think. Neighbourhood areas will get 25%, the others will get their 15% and be advised that there is a further 10% that could be bid for those infrastructure projects.
Okay, I've got Councillor Gowland and then Councillor Barney.
I've checked several times. I don't think it mentions the arrangements of West Bridgeford. I feel that's an oversight, and I think that needs to be clarified in the documents.
We can certainly clarify that, but I can confirm that West Bridgeford will be dealt with through the Special Expenses Group, and effectively they will act as the parish council almost in terms of how that money is spent in the area, and the same will apply then to the extra 10%, that the Special Expenses Group will be made aware that that 10% is there and that they can bid for it for infrastructure projects.
Thank you. So it'd be good to keep it written in.
Councillor Barney.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Pegram, for your comments. It made me feel slightly better. I've been sitting here having a complete moral breakdown because with one hand, obviously, I want the most for Sutton Bonington, but with the other, I don't want to take away from the health centre in East League. And so I think the guidance to us here today would be to not be looking at the specifics, but the general principles, to take that pressure off of me.
You certainly can, Mr. Pegram.
Yeah, it may well be that development in Sutton Bonington is going to have an impact on infrastructure in East League, and it may be that Sutton Bonington want to support the spend of their extra 10%. Can it be spent in the neighbouring area, Matt?
Well, it's strategic still.
Yeah, so it may be that we say to Sutton Bonington Parish Council, you have an extra 10% to spend. Have you got a will to spend it on something? And they say, yes, we'd like to help East League deliver their health centre, for instance.
I feel much better, but you've prompted another question. And I've asked this before, and the answer was no. But but the comment there made me think we might be able to get some movement. So with school places in Sutton Bonington, there wasn't a requirement, and so no extra 106 money was asked for. I know we're talking about SIL, but I asked the question whether we couldn't ask that for East League, where it's desperately needed, and it's just over the border, and was told no. I was just disappointed to lose the opportunity to get money for primary school places, which is desperately needed 2 miles away.
Yeah, the difference is the infrastructure list includes education, but only secondary education for SIL. Primary education would be collected through Section 106, and that would be based on, again, the County Council's Education Authority demonstrating that there is a shortfall in places in the catchment area. So there is a difference between primary and secondary. Normally, primary is more local to the development and is therefore dealt with through 106, whereas secondary is more strategic and a wider area.
So for SIL and secondary, there would be a process, but there isn't for 106.
No.
I won't ask the question again. Thank you. So you've learned a lesson tonight. Good thing you came. Right. So does anyone else have any questions or comments? I think we've covered a lot of points. We've got the recommendation shown on page 11 and indeed repeated on page 15, which is support the referral of the SIL allocation and spend process to Cabinet, support a recommendation to Cabinet to make an additional amount of strategic SIL available to areas without a neighbourhood plan, make comments and recommendations on the process to help inform the production of the framework document. And as mentioned, shall we add a paragraph in about parish councils, perhaps something along the lines of send information out to parish councils and form a mechanism to assist and advise parish councils. So would we all be happy with doing that? Yep. So I better formally move that, haven't I? So does anyone wish to second that? So Councillor Way is the first hand that went up. So have we got all that, Mrs. Coop? We've covered a lot there. Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Phil, and good luck with your ongoing activities with SIL, because it is quite it's a big thing. And,
thank you very much. If there are any ideas or questions, particularly in reference to the framework document and the assessment criteria, if something crops up after this meeting, please let me know, because any information which helps us inform that process would be welcomely received. So thank you.
So what you're really saying is don't hesitate to ask. Yeah. Okay. Good. And I think it will be understandable because it's a big thing for us all, and indeed for the authority as a whole, and as we're hearing as well from the parish councils and everyone out there. So thank you for that. So we'll move on to our next item, which is the COVID-19 business recovery update. And Kath, Mrs. Evans, you're doing this for us, aren't you? So, okay. Thank you. Who would have thought planning and civil could be so fascinating? It's just... Anyway, sorry, over to you.
So good evening, everyone. This will be a bit of a double act between myself and Caroline. So for those that don't know, I'm Catherine. I'm Service Manager for Economic Growth and Property Services. Do you want to introduce yourself, Caroline?
Yes, Caroline Saxton, Economic Growth Officer.
Thank you. So the presentation that we'll run through this evening follows the format of the report. So there's a little bit of data that we'll share with you about the impact of COVID. Caroline will talk about what we've done so far, and then I'll talk about our future plans, which is where we'd really like any other additional ideas that you might have about how we could spend some of the welcome back funding or anything else that we might be doing to support our businesses. It was in the report, but also to note that we've also been taking regular reports to Cabinet about our response to COVID. That's a much broader report that covers more of what the council has done as a whole, but it has included the work of the economic growth team in there as well. So that was most recently in July this year, and then there's another report due to go to Cabinet in November as well. So in terms of the data, so there was some high level information in the report that was sent out. So the information I'll give you this evening might differ slightly because obviously this is slightly more up to date than the information in the report. But this information, in case anybody's very interested, is on the D2N2 Local Enterprise Partnership website, so it's publicly available, and it's their economic dashboard. So they regularly update that information. So if you do want to have a look, I'd be happy to share the link. But it's quite interesting to track as we go through the months. So I'll take you through some of the information on the slide. So in terms of furlough and self-employment claims, this information is for Rushcliffe specifically. So they've been decreasing since January 2021. The latest figures on there are for June, which obviously doesn't take account of the fact that furlough has now ended, but it gives an indication of the number of people at that point that were on furlough. So that's 8.8% of the total employed population at pre-pandemic levels. So all those people that were employed pre-pandemic, 8.8% of those were on furlough in June this year. So one of the stats that the impact of furlough was less in Rushcliffe, or there was less people on furlough than in other areas of Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire, because there was a higher proportion of jobs that were, I think the term was teleworkable, so basically people could work from home. More people are in occupations where you can work from home, so less people were put on furlough. It was about 8.8% in June. In terms of unemployment, it's maintained a steady decline since significant spikes in March and April last year, and they're currently at around 1,795 people, which is a 22.6% decline on the same month last year. Now, obviously, that's a significant decline, but obviously we're in the middle of COVID this time last year, so isn't necessarily reflective of the usual levels of unemployment in Rushcliffe. So unemployment figures for February-March 2020, to give you a better idea, were around 1,000. So we've not recovered to pre-pandemic levels yet, but we are recovering. So the graph that you can see at the bottom of the screen is the annual unemployment levels since 2009. So you can see the significant peak there in August. So obviously each year it's August, so you can see the significant peak in August 2020 and how that's declining. And obviously you can see going back to sort of 2009, 2010, obviously was the impact of the recession. So the impact of COVID was greater on employment levels than the recession. Moving on to jobs, so after a drop in March 2020, the latest job vacancy figures show a 40% growth compared to the same month last year. So those jobs are mainly in health and social care sectors, as well as business and technology and administration. And then the final bit is about business closures. So this information is only available at a county level. It's not broken down to Rushcliffe, but the data shows spikes, as you can see, significant spikes on the graph, the blue graph on the far side of the screen. But that is because there was temporary suspensions of company strike-offs throughout the pandemic. So that will result in this irregular reporting and processing of information by Companies House. So the data will continue to be monitored, and then that will be a better indication of trends in terms of business closures. So that doesn't really give a clear indication because of those temporary strike-offs. Moving on to a slide. So this, again, this data is Rushcliffe level data, and this is taken from something called the Decision Makers Panel. It's a monthly survey of finance directors of small, medium and large businesses across the UK. There are around 9,000 directors on that panel. So this information shows the answer to the question, relative to what otherwise would have happened, what is your best estimate for the impact of COVID on sales, employment and capital expenditure? So as you can see, there's not expected to recover to pre-COVID levels before 2022. So yeah, that's you can see the information there. And so things like expected impact on investment in quarter 3 2021 is down 6.2% versus what they would have expected without COVID and what they would have predicted without COVID. And the same goes for the other figures on the screen. And I'll hand over to Caroline.
Thank you. Yeah, so a lot of our work has been focused on the high street, especially with the reopening high street safely funding and now the welcome back funding. So we've been trying to get some statistics because we also have to report on this as part of the claims procedure. We did have a guy called Jacob working with us, and he did a lot of work around identifying how many vacant properties there were in and around Rushcliffe throughout the pandemic. As at the end of August this year, there are only 10 vacant premises in our 7 major towns and villages across Rushcliffe. The highest level was 21, and I believe that was around January time. So that's definitely decreased over the last few months. There are 4 in West Bridgeford, 2 in Bingham, 1 in Ruddington and Radcliffe-on-Trent, and 3 in Keyworth. There are other premises that are listed as under offer, but we know that they're going to be developed or businesses are still operating, so they haven't been included. So that's all quite positive. We have been measuring footfall levels at times as well, been 3 times a day in the same place in January, April and August, and again we have to report on those levels as part of the reopening high street safety funding. As you can see from the table, they've all increased between January and April. Obviously January's lockdown and April was starting to open up. And most have increased again between April and August, apart from Eastleigh, Keyworth and Radcliffe-on-Trent, which had reductions. So yeah, that's the figures that they stand at the moment. Again, we'll be monitoring those until March 2022 when the funding ends. Okay, so going back right to the start of lockdown, we obviously had to step up a gear. We started by switching Rushcliffe Business Partnership because obviously we've got a close working relationship with them. We switched to virtual networking. 24 sessions were hosted over the year and a bit, and we got over about 500 attendees. I think they found it quite a good support network for each other, especially sort of working from home. We have recently started face-to-face events. The first one was on the 24th of September at the Cricket Club in-person event, and it was quite well attended with about 30 people that attended, I believe. We also set up a dedicated coronavirus business support webpage. It's had over 40,000 views. And obviously we used it as a sort of source of information, both for businesses and for the general public. Right in the beginning, our team helped revenues with the distribution of the business rates grants. And to date, we've distributed over £35 million worth of business rate grants between April 2020 and May 2021. We've had a lot of positive feedback from businesses about the way that was distributed. So that was a good sort of teamwork effort. After the initial lockdown, and when we were awarded the Reopening High Street Safely funding, we started to look at initiatives that we could deliver to help the high streets. We worked closely with our comms team to do a lot of communications campaigns. We did We Are Open, sort of featuring a lot of businesses. Obviously the Eat Out to Help Out, which was a government-led initiative. And we introduced the Shop Local, Shop Safe initiative using the funding to sort of encourage people to use their local high street, which we tended to find that people were doing anyway. But, you know, it's sort of an additional way that people could realise the importance of supporting their local high street. We also procured the support of 2 consultants, and between them they delivered 10 business support webinars. That was funded by the Reopening High Street Safely Fund, and it was basically giving advice to businesses on how to trade safely and reopen safely after the pandemic. They also were entitled to one-to-one business support, and 24 businesses actually took advantage of that funding. We also appointed high street ambassadors down at the bottom there, the picture. Really, they were to sort of provide a bit of reassurance to the public that there was a presence on the high street, and they sort of monitored footfall, made us aware of any issues that were around and about on the sort of high street and neighbouring areas and parks and things like that. We also delivered a Rushcliffe gift voucher initiatives. We awarded £25 for residents to spend in participating businesses across the borough, and they have council already been with one of said vouchers. Okay, other initiatives, both last year and this year. I did a lot of work with our markets, well, myself and Catherine did a lot of work with the markets, helping them to trade throughout the pandemic, and we worked to relocate West Bridgeford Farmers Market to Bridgeford Road car park temporarily, because there were issues about them being on the croquet lawn and causing obstructions to the pavement, and that worked really well. There was some car parking initiatives in the first lockdown. There was temporary free car parking for a certain period, and more recently we delivered the 3 after 3 scheme in council-owned car parks. We also used some of what was the Shopfront Improvement Grant to launch a digital grant of up to £1,000 that businesses could apply for. It provided financial support for businesses to develop their online presence. We received quite a lot of applications, about 32 applications so far, and 20 businesses have had their schemes approved, and we've paid them out. So moving on to sort of more recent events, obviously the Reopening High Street Safely funding, that was extended to include the Welcome Back funding. And what we did with that was we allocated £10,000 each to our larger parishes for them to spend on initiatives themselves. And we've been looking at initiatives across the borough as well with the rest of the spend. in West Bridgeford specifically, we've run an enhanced programme of events. You may have seen them advertised. There was outdoor theatre, family fun day, an event on Melton Road, a Sunday cinema, and we're planning a pumpkin carving event for Halloween. We've both been working closely with the parishes on ideas for them to spend their allocation and claim it back. And yeah, it's been a challenge, but because the fund is quite prescriptive, and the criteria for spend is quite restrictive as well. But we're getting there with it, and all the parishes, most of them, like ourselves, have been looking at initiatives to increase footfall by putting on events in the high streets and surrounding areas. And finally, from September, we appointed our current Bingham market manager, a lady called Ophelia Gamble. We've appointed her to offer some consultancy work to our town centres. So she's working on a temporary basis. She's starting in September, and she's done some initial walk rounds in our high streets, and has made contact with a lot of businesses, and has made some initial findings, initial reports. She's very enthusiastic. I don't know whether any of you have met her, but she is a force of nature, and we're looking forward to, seeing over the coming months sort of ideas and initiatives that she can come up with, including trying to build on sort of existing networking and forums that we've got around the borough. Yeah, so it's been a busy year and a half. Back over to you, Catherine.
Thank you. So in terms of future plans, Caroline's already touched on this, but we'll continue to work with the 6 town and parish councils to use their allocation of £10,000. So that's obviously with Christmas coming, that'll be around enhancements to Christmas events or new Christmas events if they've not been done before. And any visual improvements to town centres, so additional planters or painting bollards, that kind of thing is where the money can be used. I think we've set out before there's quite strict criteria around the allocation of that funding, so we're working closely with our parishes to support them through that process. So it's not us saying no if we do say no to something. In terms of events, as Caroline's mentioned, we'll continue with some high streets events, including a pumpkin carving in West Bridgeford, and we share our ideas and the support, as I've said, with our parish councils, and I know some of them are looking at that as an idea as well. In terms of communications messages, we've had, as you'll all be very well aware, a lot of conversations with some of our hospitality businesses about the struggle they are having with recruiting to vacancies, particularly chefs and more experienced front of house staff. So we are advertising recruitment vacancies on our council website channels, social media channels. So we've asked businesses to send those through to us when we get them. And I've also had conversations with the County Council and DWP about the possibility of doing a sort of dedicated jobs fair, potentially in some of our town centres to support hospitality businesses. We've got our ongoing communication campaigns around shop local, shop safe. So we'll be doing some more work around that. And then we're looking at opportunities for extending the digital promotion of our high street. So you'll all be familiar with, hopefully, West Bridgeford Way. So that's our social media channel to promote West Bridgeford, and how we can enhance that and get more business engagement in that in the future. And then how we can support some of our towns and parishes with their digital promotion of their high streets too, how we can use some of that best practice in some of those other areas. In terms of engagement with businesses, as Caroline's mentioned, we've got Ophelia until the end of March, and one of her key areas of focus really is establishing some kind of retail forums or steering groups, whatever you want to call them, to try and encourage retailers to work together. We have a really strong business partnership, Rushford Business Partnership, but that we generally don't get retailers, hospitality businesses engaging in that because they largely feel like they're being preyed on by those businesses that are accountants or PR and marketing companies. So we wanted dedicated kind of high street forums. So like I say, so those businesses can work together and think about future events and promotion and that kind of thing. As Caroline's mentioned, we've returned to networking in person for Rushford Business Partnership. So we had our first networking at Escobesh in West Bridgford. There's also a Ruddington event, and that will now be the first Friday of each month in West Bridgford. We'll have our face-to-face networking, assuming COVID restrictions remain as they are. We're planning a Rushford Business Partnership annual event, hopefully early in the new year, and that's going to be discussed at our steering group meeting on Friday, what the theme of that might be. And we will continue to try and build relationships with some of our local businesses, and the growth boards that some of you are involved in. We're encouraging local businesses to be part of those discussions, to give us information and to help inform how we can support our town centres in the future. And then the last point on there, we've established a big business carbon club. So that's, as it quite clearly states, really, it's our big businesses. So there's about 6 big businesses that sit on the carbon club, and the idea is that they are there to really act as our champions to support businesses in reducing their carbon footprint. So at the moment they've only met a couple of times, so at the moment they're kind of sharing their own journeys and what they're each doing, but the idea is, as I say, that they will become our champions and support their own supply chains and our small and medium enterprises to reduce carbon footprint. And alongside that, I'm working with colleagues from the county and the universities and some of our other districts about how we make the low carbon business support more understandable and accessible to businesses, because if you start looking on any website, there's quite a lot of information there about what's available. So how do we streamline that support and make it just easier for business to see, well, that's the right thing for me. So that's another piece of work that we're doing alongside our colleagues. So that was it from us, I think. So.
Thank you. There's a lot there, isn't there? And you only have to look at the report on page 25 and just how much has been done in a relatively short space of time. We really hit the ground running, didn't we? All of us when this thing hit. Just very quickly before others come in, the point Caroline and indeed you made about Ophelia, the town centre, I will confirm that she has indeed been busy in the big villages. In my part of the world, I can see Councillor Way nodding her head as well, that we've had a couple of us members have had at least an hour, probably more, walking around the village centre or the town centre. And I know as well from feedback that she has been in to see shops and businesses there already. And you're quite right, she's got a lot of energy. So, does anyone have any questions, comments, or queries? Well, if not, while you're thinking about that, you know the slide we had about the, I've just written it down, I can't remember I'm writing now. Yeah, the footfall counting slide. I may have missed it when you were going through that, but how what do we mean by that? What do those numbers actually show?
Right, so we
Just need to put your microphone on.
Sorry, we physically went out three times a day, so once in the morning, once at lunchtime, and once sort of early evening, and did a manual count. So that is take the top line in January. That is the total number of people that we counted throughout those three times a day. So it's a sort of snapshot of how many people at that particular period of time.
So it's literally that. Is it someone standing with a clicker type of thing, or just a pad doing 5-bar chart?
Yes,
Gates
yeah.
To see how many people are walking by. Is that? I mean,
we delegated most of the work to Jacob,
right?
but we did share it between us a little bit. Yes. To be honest, it's not wonderfully accurate because it is a very small snapshot, and obviously it depends what the weather was like. Yeah, so it's indicative.
I just wasn't absolutely sure how we did that. I'm just curious to know. So,
yeah, we did actually have to watch a YouTube video about how to do it.
Right.
which is fascinating.
You were telling me next you had to do a health and safety assessment as well, or
Quite possibly.
okay. Thanks. It was just a genuine query I had. And any other questions or suggestions? What about you know, when we talk about, I should know this, but perhaps it's escaped me. And but when we talk about the long-term unemployment, so we're comparing long-term unemployment to the effect of the pandemic. How do we define? How is it defined? How is long-term unemployment defined? Is it sort of unemployed for X number of months a year? Do we know?
No, yeah. Well, you have, because we don't know.
Oh,
Well,
right.
no.
Okay.
So I suppose the answer to that question is it's unemployment level. So it's those people that are claiming some kind of benefits at any one point in time. So it's not necessarily long-term unemployed, it's unemployed.
Right. Okay. Fine. Oh, and we collate all those figures here somewhere. We've got the.
We don't. So that's the information that is that the
We get that from
D22
the
location.
D2N2.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. That's fine. Just wanted to be a little bit clear on that. Right. So yes. Thank you, Councillor Phillips.
Thank you, Chairman. I was going to ask the same question about the footfall, whether it was on, you know, if it was on a Monday as opposed to a Friday, you're going to get different sort of footfall, and again with the weather. One of the other questions was leisure is obviously quite big within Rushcliffe, and I just wondered how that is bouncing back, particularly, you know, over the sort of lockdown, everybody going out and buying gym equipment. You know, how people got fed up with the gym equipment at home, and are they now coming back into leisure? And how does our own sort of leisure centres compare with, you know, the private ones, the Rocos and the David Lloyds and things like that? Are we bouncing back?
That's more something that would be covered in the report that goes to Cabinet, because it's would fall into Darryl Birch's area. But I know when he was talking at a meeting I was at a few weeks ago, he was talking about, I think here specifically, but Parkwood is seeing that about 70% of their membership are coming back into the leisure centres now. But I don't know how that compares to David Lloyd or Roco or anywhere else, but I can see Darryl has that information.
Mr. Baker.
I was at the same meeting with Catherine and Darryl, and I think the one area that has shown an increase, I'm right in saying, is swimming. And there's the swimming pools are a lot busier than they were previously. So.
Probably not surprising, but there we are. Now, on the high street health figures we're talking about, obviously we assume it's retail, but is it just retail premises that we're talking about? Because we do have other things on high streets, don't we, such as leisure and indeed some offices, employment. Do they form part of the figures as well?
No, this was just purely based on retail, because that's what we had to report on as part of the funding.
Okay, and then with regards to the grants, the welcome back funding that's coming to the parishes, I know some of that you mentioned, and we know as well that there's quite a lot of strict what you can and can't do. Are those policies from us, or are they the policies that come from government or the D2N2?
The funding is actually European funding, so it's the EU that send us these intricate documents with this is what you can spend it on, and basically it's the eligibility criteria. But as part of that, there's a lot of information sharing between the councils, because obviously everybody was in the same position. So when the funding was announced and the guidance came out, I think a lot of people were, you know, trying to interpret the guidance, asking questions. So they've now got this knowledge hub set up, so an online sort of community where people can share ideas, you know, ask questions about eligibility. We have got an email that we can message to say we're thinking of doing this, is this eligible? Because obviously we're spending at risk, and we're asking the parishes to spend at risk, and then, you know, when we make the claim, we have to spend the money before we can then claim the funding back. So we have had to be very careful about what we have spent the money on, and making sure it does fit with the criteria. as I said, the welcome back funding, the criteria is, it's broadened. It was quite difficult to spend the RHSS funding, but with the sort of beautification and by talking to others and the sort of increase in footfall, it's been a lot easier, if you like, to fit in with the criteria. But there are all sorts of other issues that we've come around publicity and branding. We have to mention the funding. So there's been a lot of contact with the parishes around, you know, yes, okay, you're spending at risk, but we're here. You know, we've read that guidance. We wouldn't expect them to necessarily read all of it. We've tried to pull out the main points. But yeah, it's been good. It's been a very much two-way process. You know, them coming to us, we've got this idea, and us sort of saying, yes, you know, that would fit in with the criteria in our view. So, you know, go ahead and stand at risk.
Are you able to sort of let the cat out the bag? Have we didn't get any weird, strange requests that we could absolutely say no to, or is it possibly an unfair question, really?
Strangely enough, I don't think we have.
Well, there we are. So people were playing along and sorry, not playing along. They were following the rules and the guidance as they should do.
Absolutely.
Oh, good. Well, that's fine. Brilliant. Right. Okay. Any other questions? Or I mean, again, I'm holding it, I'm afraid. But yes. Councillor Dickman, please.
You've got Bingham, Rillington, and also West Bridgeford, where the footfall is substantially more in August. Is that down to the market? Because they're all to market chairs, aren't they? They've all got their own street market, whether it's Central Avenue or Rillington or.
We were trying to analyse this earlier today, weren't we? It's a bit of an unknown, to be honest. Potentially, it's because of the markets, but I don't think we did any of the football counting on market day, did we?
No, we didn't. I think we did these on a Tuesday, if that helps. But yeah, so it is, and I think part of it depends on, because we had to do this because of the funding that we were allocated, and as Caroline mentioned, there was quite a long guidance note about how you do football counting, and it prescribes that you have to sit in a particular place in the town centre, and it has to be the same place every time that you do it, and the same time of day every time you do it, and the same day of the week every time you do it. So it possibly depends on where you're sitting. So you could be sitting in a place that, in Bingham, for example, if you sat next to the co-op, you probably have quite a lot of people walking past you going into the co-op, and that kind of thing. Whereas in Radcliffe-on-Trent, you could be sat at the wrong end of the main high street. Yeah, so it's just an indication, I think, really of
just put it down to the fact that Rillington and West Bridgeford and Bingham got probably more pubs than. Oh yeah.
Well, that's another thing. People not going away on holiday. Yeah, that's good. And just going back to the list on paragraph 4.8 as to what we've done. I mean, I had to read this a few times. The second point that says distributed over £35 million worth of business rate grants. That's not a typo, is it? I mean, 35 million. That's incredible. That is correct, isn't it?
If it is typo, it's Catherine's typo.
So it is a typo. 35, it does say that, doesn't it? Or is it me with my eyesight? Distributed over 35.3 million.
That's the information I've had from our revenues team. So that's all of the business rates grants that government have given us that were paid out to businesses. So the 10 and 15 and £1,000 that were given to businesses that pay business rates in the hospitality sector, and
so 35 million. That seems. Well, maybe it's just me. Maybe I just think that's incredibly high. I mean, but it'll be great if it's helping businesses. I mean, do we know how? I mean, it's probably an unfair question, but I mean, is there any sort of comparison with other authorities, other areas? Do we know? Are we doing particularly well in that respect, or is it hard to?
We had really good feedback about how quickly we paid out our grants and the process that we went through initially. So I think we did quite well on that, and I think we've submitted for an award for that as well. And I can get that information from Rob, but I don't have it to hand.
No, I was just genuinely interested in, because obviously it's nice to know how we're comparing to other areas. Fine. Okay. And then the only other thing going through my mind again on this is because, let's face it, it's been a terrible 18 months for everyone, one way or another. We've all thrown in at the deep end, ground running, unknown territory, all the rest of it. And I don't just wonder whether we're shouting enough about what we've done. I mean, I still think there's a lot of people out there just don't realise how much this council does or has done, and indeed other local authorities. But obviously, we're interested in Rushcliffe. I mean, we've done things in Rushcliffe reports, but I'm not sure if there's anything else we can do to sort of tell people, because otherwise, one day when we're over, hopefully when we're over this crisis, it will be quickly forgotten. I don't know. It's just a thought to keep in mind, isn't it? It's sort of, we've done our bit, something to be proud of, I think. Or am I getting a bit too emotional? Yes. Okay. Right, digressing a bit. But does anyone have any other comments or suggestions or questions, or are we happy to look at the recommendations, which is on page 28, which is to welcome the work we have carried out. We definitely have done that. Welcome the work carried out so far to support businesses in responding to the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Endorse proposed future activity, and we've heard about that and the work that's going on, in particular with the village or the town centre retail work. And we're considering alternative opportunities to support businesses in Rushcliffe for further exploration. Are there any other wonderful ideas tonight? Or if not, perhaps if we think about them, we can sort of feed them into you as the next few weeks and months go on. Okay, so are we all happy with that? So I better formally move that. Does someone want to second that? So those recommendations, please. Councillor Cotty will second those. So thank you. So thank you, Caroline, for that. So right. So the final item on the agenda is the work programme, which is for noting. Our next meeting sounds a long way away, but knowing how quickly time goes, it'll soon be here. It's in January, and we have two items on there. We have one item at the moment, the tree conservation, and then the work programme. So do we have any other thoughts in our mind yet for what else might be on that agenda, or is that something to come back to? Blank. Still some time to go, isn't there? So we're happy with that then. So that'll be the next meeting in January.
I was just going to say, there's from the previous meeting, there's the recommendation for cycling to come back, and that's proposed for April. But and I can have a conversation with yourself and Councillor Clark about what comes back.
What we need to do.
Yeah.
I know there has been some following that meeting. There has been some interest. Basically, people asking just that: what is the next step? What's the next stage? So we need to we will have a discussion about that. Okay, right. So with that, then I think that's everything covered for tonight. So it's 8:42. We'll close the meeting, and thank you for your attendance, and thank you, officers, for your presentations as well. It's a meaty subject tonight, so thank you very much. Okay, I'll close the meeting. Thank you.